Ok,
Sí, no hay problema.
ok, aquí estamos. Ok, estábamos en esta diapositiva, ¿verdad?
Sí,
No, en la
No,
pasada, sí, ahora sí.
¿ahora sí?
Sí.
sí, ahora sí.
Ok, perfecto.
Bueno, ahora continuamos con los procesos de nominación continuamos con la nominación de los procesos colonizadores en Puerto Rico. Normalmente esto se menciona a través de eufemismo. Eso significa que son mencionados como de una forma más suave, en vez de decir explotación o abuso hacia la comunidad africana, sino lo ponen como una forma más, pero con una agenda más, menos colonizadora, entre comillas. Por ejemplo, los viajes de exploración y el descubrimiento de Puerto Rico. El comercio de esclavos era en realidad una diáspora comercial. O, según el historiador Adolfo de Agosto, los padres jerónimos obtuvieron una licencia para introducir negros a las Indias, que vemos como una intención de opacar el sentido colonial.
De la misma forma, perdón, nos faltó la parte de Chile. Gracias. De la misma forma, esta estrategia o esta estructura discursiva se encuentra a través del eufemismo, porque también se denomina proyectos de exploración y empresas de conquista. De alguna forma mostrar la ausencia de una intencionalidad más bien colonizadora y de dominación a través del uso de estos matices discursivos. Y también está el uso de la metáfora, que nos podría dar luces de que el choque entre dos mundos podría explicitar a qué se refiere justamente esto. Sin embargo, se menciona la metáfora, pero nunca se explica por qué se denomina choque entre dos mundos, por qué hubo visiones distintas. Podría haber dado la oportunidad de que aquí se explicara el sistema de dominación europea, sin embargo no se trata. Eso.
Dentro de esta diapositiva estamos viendo la representación de la acción social. Serían los verbos, las acciones que hacen la comunidad dominante y la comunidad africana, o que proviene de África. La gente europea o las potencias colonizadoras construyen un fortín, se dedican al cultivo de caña, establecían, introducían, buscaron aumentar riqueza, impulsaron proyectos, iniciaron viajes. Son todas acciones activas. Pues siempre son los que hacen, los que tienen la agencia realmente, supuestamente.
Por otra parte, en cuanto a las identidades africanas, estos tienen una construcción pasiva y por lo tanto una desagencialización de su rol social. Y eso se observa, por ejemplo, con verbos en donde hay instrumentalización, como cambiaron, y también la pasivación en la construcción discursiva. Por lo tanto, siempre son agentes pacientes a través de los discursos de los textos escolares. Pasamos a la siguiente.
Bueno, como conclusiones, tenemos el ocultamiento de la agenda colonial, tanto en el caso de Chile y Puerto Rico. El uso de los eufemismos en los textos intenta expresar en los lectores una intencionalidad aparente, inocente, de intercambio comercial no violento, solo de recursos naturales.
Esto también se observa en la referencia minoritaria del tráfico transatlántico de indígenas africanos, en tan solo 3 líneas. Esto tiene relación con las estrategias discursivas e ideológicas, donde se plantea de forma muy breve este tópico y detalla muchos otros temas aparentemente menos problemáticos en los libros de estudio, como la geografía. El enfoque, José.
El enfoque economicista del texto de Puerto Rico se observa al naturalizar la explotación de los recursos naturales y del tráfico de personas. Normalmente el texto de Puerto Rico tiene un aspecto más como la historia es una historia económica, de cómo se formuló la economía europea. Sí.
Por último, y para terminar, la agencialización de las identidades europeas y la desagencialización discursiva de las personas africanas nos da cuenta de la continuidad de la colonialidad y por lo tanto de la revisión permanente de los tipos de textos que leemos y cómo se emplean en nuestras prácticas sociales. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Aplauso. Y gracias por su paciencia con la señal, el internet que se cayó y también con mis mal manipulaciones de la diapositiva. De todas maneras, hemos oído 3 presentaciones excelentes y ahora ha llegado el momento para preguntas y comentarios. Entonces, una presentación sobre la migración de hablantes de criollos a base léxica inglesa en el Caribe. Otra presentación sobre la inclusión del criollo de limón en Costa Rica como forma de expresión cultural. Y finalmente, una presentación sobre la representación de la esclavitud en los sistemas educativos de Chile y Puerto Rico. ¿Comentarios? ¿Preguntas?
Bueno, yo quería hablar con Josué y con María Luisa, que me gustó mucho la presentación porque es como que yéndonos más al micro, me encantaron los ejemplos sobre el uso de idioma, cómo se perpetúan estas agencias coloniales europeas, que eso es algo que muchas personas no se dan cuenta. De hecho, cuando estábamos preparándonos para el panel nosotros, no nos dio tiempo y tampoco, yo pensando acá que cuando leímos esos materiales tampoco... Simplemente como, what's the word I'm looking for? Disculpen que me metí en Spanglish. Como que lo asimilamos porque es a lo que nos han expuesto aquí en Puerto Rico. Y es como que, pues, así es que se expresan. Pero la presentación de ustedes como que es tremenda porque va a eso. Es como que dice como que aquí de estas maneras es que se perpetúan estos sistemas, estas hegemonías de poder. So, me gustó mucho y es como que un es un sentimiento encontrado de que pues me da algo de paz saber que Puerto Rico no es el único lugar que enfrenta esto, pero también es tristeza porque es como que wow, tenemos mucho que trabajar por cambiar esta narrativa de que lo europeo es lo más importante o es lo que cuenta la historia a través de excelente trabajo y felicidades también a los otros paneles que me gustaron mucho.
Además, eso significa que hay muchos espacios posibles, muchas oportunidades de colaboración entre Puerto Rico y otro país como Chile para enfrentar a estos retos. So you can, if you consider this particular presentation, the one that Malu and Joshua gave with the presentation this morning by Stella and Virginia and Michael. Again, this is what Stella was talking about, that they did it from a very macro kind of perspective, and then Joshua and Malu did it from a more micro perspective, really paying attention to the actual words being used. And so both of those types of studies are very important and they really complement each other. So that's really nice. But another thing though about marginalization of peoples yes, we can. Yeah, a marginalization of people. Can you hear me? ¿Se puede oír? Okay.
Sí.
Yeah. Okay. Professor Kuwabong just rang me. I don't know exactly why. I thought maybe the signal went out, but in any case, let's see if he rings again. Okay. But in any case, let's see. Yasmin's coming in. Okay. I think maybe he got disconnected because I don't see him up here. Just 1 minute. Let's make sure that Professor Kuwabong can come inside. Hola? You no get internet. Okay. So we go continue now. Now, anytime you want come inside, I go invite you. Okay, thank you. Okay, bye. Okay, disculpa, that was Professor Kuwabong. He just said that the internet has gone off at his house. So that's why he's not with us. He's with us in spirit, but maybe not in terms of the screen. Okay, so if you don't see him on the screen, that doesn't mean he's not there. Okay, any case. So yeah, so marginalization of peoples, very, I think all of you are talking about that, but it's interesting because when you look at what Anna was saying, Anna, I mean, when we read the history books, it's always about what decisions were being made in London by all these rich male merchants, English merchants. But in fact, you hardly ever mentioned those in your presentation. Who are the real people who were doing it?
The real people were right here in the Caribbean, the indigenous peoples, the Africans who were sent as slaves, and the renegades and the privateers, all of them that came to the Caribbean. They were the ones that were really responsible.
Yes, and this connects again with what Perla was saying, because Perla is talking about this one place in Costa Rica which is so different from the rest of Costa Rica. It's almost as if for centuries, it wasn't even part of Costa Rica. That, in fact, it might have been treated more like a Caribbean island, even though there wasn't an island. Do you think, Perla, that things are changing now? How are people hopeful about Limones, or do they think that the people from the other parts of the country are going to continue discriminating against them and their language and their culture? What's the feeling? What did you feel from your interviews? What are people? What kind of expectation do people have for the future?
So when talking to the participants, one of the things that always was there is the generational impact, and how, because of how many generations, like the older generations, were treated specifically towards the language, and how they could not use it in the schools because they would be pushed aside or discriminated. It has had a very big impact into them transmitting their language.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of young people from the community trying to bring it afloat. Now that's where the choque, I forgot. That's where the confrontation, the conflict can be seen most, because you have a group of young people trying to bring this language back or visibilize it, because that's the thing, it never left. It's always there, and many of the people from the community use this language every single day with their families, with their friends. Even you go to the streets, you can hear them talking, and that's what they're trying to show other people. Something that also became very important for the presentations and the interviews is that many of how can I say this? Many of the studies that have been conducted in Limon have been by other people, and in that case, well, I am an outsider to a certain extent, and only because I was able to have a community member with me is that I was able to actually get the information, actually talk to people, get the connections, because their own people are not investigating about it. They are not bringing it to light, and how their language is so important to them. Why is it's being used as tourists appreciate this language. They've seen it all over and they've tried learning it. The multilingual aspect of it is also tied with the multicultural part, because they have people from all over of the world. They have Asians, they have Italians, they have ethnicities of all sorts. And even though I was only able to talk to Afro descendants, it is something that they are learning this language, even if it's not their first language, because they know it's so important to the actual community. So yeah, it has to be from the inside out. And that's the main aspect right now, in order for it to keep going on, or at least be visibilized by government or even by its own people. It has to be something started in Limon to the world.
Okay, great. Anna, some people say that the reason why there's an English lexifier Creole in places like Limon and along the coast of Central America, they say that only started when in the late 1800s or early 1900s, when people from Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean came to build the railroads and work on the banana plantations. Anna, what would you say to that?
I would say that, like many things that we've discussed here, they just don't know the history. They don't know the truth, which is that the British were coming to Africa way before that. And they, just like all the other, like the Portuguese that came into Africa as well, and they stayed there and they had families there. The British also had families and they stayed there, and they together they had this impact in these multilingual communities becoming even more multilingual. Even before the I forgot the word, the repatriation, which is that they sent the slaves back, and it's just that they don't know. It's one of these efforts that we need to make this knowledge public, to let them understand.
So that's one of the things that people say about West Africa, that there was no English lexified Creole spoken there until Jamaicans came in the repatriation, like to Sierra Leone and that type of thing. But I'm also talking about Central America. So in other words, that whole coast. A lot of people say that there's, you really don't have to worry about anything from before, when the Jamaicans came there to work on the plantations and the railways in the late 1800s. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that the truth is migration, that you even if they don't know that they came to that coast, they could very well have, and they could in the search for the British with land and conquering, they went places as far as Singapore and even further than that. So why couldn't they have stopped along the eastern coast? Why couldn't they have stopped somewhere else? But also it's the effort of understanding where the history came to be with migration, that also with, but we also focus on the important parts where the British left. We don't focus on where the Africans also went. Like, you could have Eastern Africans go to the Western coast and they brought the language to them, or you could have had the pickpockets in the way that the language migrated on its own towards any part of Africa, because the communities migrated with their language. They migrated with their culture. One of the things that I discovered, for example, in the study, was that you had African Americans that came to República Dominicana, the Dominican Republic, and they had the Samana Peninsula, which you have an Afro-Atlantic English lexifier Creole in the Dominican Republic. And it's one of these things that's like the people migrate with their language, they migrate with their culture. So even if you don't think, or you don't know, or you don't trace, they don't speak there, or you wouldn't think that they speak English in other parts of Africa, they might as well do that. It's just that you don't know, because you might not also be part of the community and know where they went, or trace where the peoples in the communities went to.
So what happened to those people who were thrown off of San Andres and Providencia? Where did they go?
They had to go to like the Mosquito Coast. They had to go to the other islands, and in the Mosquito Coast.
And where is the Mosquito Coast?
The Mosquito Coast is along the Central American coast, where
and when did that happen?
That happened before Jamaica was even a British colony.
Right. So even before there was a Jamaica, there were people on the Central American coast speaking Afro-Atlantic English lexifier Creoles. Okay, but a lot of people erased that, just like they erased the fact that there were Afro-Atlantic English lexifier Creoles spoken on the coast of West Africa as well. Finalmente, Malou y Josué, entonces, globalmente, ¿cómo ven la situación en Chile y cómo compara la situación en Chile con la situación en Puerto Rico?
yendo específico al libro y a lo que...
Al currículo y el contenido del currículo vinculado con afrodescendientes y la esclavitud, etcétera, etcétera.
No sabría mucho qué decir, pero para motivar a Malú a comentar. Pero antes de comentar, Marisol Joseph quería hablar hace rato. Hay algo bien importante en los textos, y es que en el caso de Puerto Rico sí se menciona a la gente esclavizada. Y sí es como que sí, se esclavizaron, y obviamente tiene un enfoque capitalista, y obviamente se mencionan. Pero en el caso del libro de Chile, por lo menos en mi perspectiva, es mucho más violento porque ni siquiera se menciona a la gente africana. Entonces, la historia que se menciona en el libro de texto puertorriqueño es como intentan ser un poco más específica. Obviamente, dándole la agencia a la gente europea, pero sí siendo más específico. En el año 1441 llegaron los portugueses y hicieron qué sé yo. Pero en el caso de Chile es como, y llegaron los españoles a América del Sur. Y trajeron la esclavitud y hicieron intercambio de cacao y qué sé yo. Bien general, y nunca se menciona como, ¿y qué pasó en Chile con la comunidad africana? Ni siquiera se menciona. Como que la comunidad africana en Chile está borrada totalmente. Como que no existen. Y yo creo que Malu puede comentar un poco más de eso.
Bueno, en el texto completo, que tiene 226 páginas, solamente hay 14 menciones a personas africanas o afrodescendientes. Y de esas 14 menciones, cuando se refiere al tráfico transatlántico, solo una mención. Y cuando se refiere a las personas africanas, se refiere como al continente americano. Cuando el continente americano tiene muchos países, hay muchas condiciones sociohistóricas bastante distintas, y por lo tanto me resultó muy problemático visualizar eso. Y también hay por historiadores también de los años 80, también se expresa mucho la negación de la llegada de las personas afrodescendientes, o bien que monocausalmente de que murieron y que ya no existen. Eso es justamente son aspectos por los cuales hay que visibilizar, por ejemplo, cómo están escritos estos libros. Y yo estoy con un interés particular, por ejemplo, de denunciar la editorial Santillana, porque la editorial Santillana es española y tiene un negocio en toda América Latina a través de la publicación de los libros de estudio. Y por lo tanto, creo que este tipo de investigaciones es muy importante socializarlas con nombres de editoriales, con explicitar la falta de rigurosidad también con la cual son elaborados.
Bien, entonces, Marisol.
Hola, hola, muchas gracias de nuevo. Pues creo que el panel ha sido bastante bueno los tres, y hay muchísimas formas de cómo unirlo, como el profesor Faraclas ha dicho, ¿verdad? Una de las preguntas que el profesor Faraclas hizo es, y se lo hizo a Perla, ¿cómo es que visualiza el limonense hoy este lenguaje, verdad? Y creo que uno de los resultados que podemos ver de la presentación de Perla es que la gente joven está agarrada de ese idioma, de que ese idioma hoy no tiene forma de que vaya a desaparecer, ¿verdad? Y hay como un resurgimiento de esa identidad cultural. Otra cosa que mencionaba el profesor Faraclas es esa idea errónea que tenemos de que Limón empieza con Jamaica, ¿verdad? De que Limón empieza con Jamaica, cuando es tan sencillo como ir a Costa Rica, ir al norte, al Pacífico Norte de Costa Rica, y ver todas las influencias africanas que hay, no solo fenotípicamente, sino que en sus artefactos culturales, sus artefactos de música, sus artefactos de comida, ¿verdad? Así que definitivamente, y eso es una de las cosas que necesitamos trabajar un montón más para cambiar esa retórica de que Limón empieza con Jamaica, porque no es así. Costa Rica no empieza. Hay un libro muy bueno de Villalobos et al. Que se llama lo negro y lo blanco todo mezclado, ¿verdad? Es un libro costarricense que visita a todas estas grandes familias en Costa Rica y busca sus ancestros, y todos ellos tienen algún ancestro de origen africano, ¿verdad? Así que Costa Rica como país se forma en esa multiculturalidad, pues, que las cosas han cambiado y que somos ciegos y que queremos pensar que África no nos ha influenciado, pues otra cosa, pero hay mucho trabajo que hacer ahí. Una pregunta que me gustaría hacerle directamente a Perla es, Perla, usted menciona en su trabajo que, y usted lo presentó como una de las limitaciones, pues que entrevistó solo a gente de origen afrodescendiente, importantísimo, pero que también se debe incluir gente de otros grupos étnicos. ¿Por qué usted dice esto?
Esta influencia, this influence from different ethnicities from different parts of the world has been very, very common in Limón, and it has been in Limón for many years. This means that the community is very diverse. Why should it be from multiple ethnicities? Because that is the community. It is represented by multiple ethnicities. One of the comments that was very common among the participants is that even El Chino de la Pulperia speaks in the Limonese Creole. That would be like a mini market. And this means that even the manager, like the Asian manager from the mini market, speaks in the language. So why wouldn't that be important? Why shouldn't we include him too? He has an opinion about the language and how it has influenced him as like in his commerce, in his daily life, and his economical well-being. I am sure that not only him, but a lot of people from the community, from Italians, Indians, and any other ethnicity or group of like cultural group, has impacted Limón in such a way that they all live, they all represent Limón, independently if they're of Afro-Caribbean descent or not. And
okay,
it's very important.
Okay, thank you. I think it's important to point out that in Costa Rica, when you go to the Caribe, you have the Bribri group, and Bribri is a different language. And because of their contact with the Afro-descendant community and their Limonese Creole, they learn, not only the Afro-descendant community learn the Bribri, but the Bribris learn Limonese Creole. So how do they manage this? And what is the status of the language used by these other ethnic groups? I think it's fantastic. I think your presentation here was really, really good. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we could go on, but we have to get to our next session, I guess. So if there are any other questions or any other comments for this piece. Okay, let's give them all a great big hand. Applause. And welcome back, Professor Kuwabong.
I'm using my phone now because so the internet is still not on.
Oh, sorry.
Faraclas, yo tengo un comentario chiquitito.
Sí, just one.
Chiquitito. Uno, primero que quería saludar a mi hermana. Entró, yay. Y segundo, a Perla, yo creo que es interesante conectar el Limón con lo que se está haciendo con la ABC Island. Faraclas sabe más de eso. Como que a coger ese piloto y quizás no sé si alguna de estas escuelas esté interesada en utilizarlo como apoderar el Limón. Sí.
Ok, yo creo que Josué está hablando de un modelo plurilingüe.
Que se desconectó, que se desconectó, pero sobre ese comentario, ciertamente debemos entrar y mirar ese modelo que se ha trabajado, que el profesor Faraclas ha trabajado en Aruba y Curazao. Gracias por esa recomendación.
No, y me llamó la especial atención. Me llamó especial atención porque hay una parte que Perla habla sobre lo económico, que el limonís se ve como algo como, o sea, Standard English es lo que te va a conectar con una buena economía. Pero muy estratégicamente, Faraclas ha hablado ya en otro sitio y en otra parte que se puede usar esa misma estrategia para decir como, no, pero es que el limoní se puede usar como herramienta para aprender otros idiomas y utilizarse capitalistamente
Claro.
como herramienta para conseguir otro idioma, pero la realidad es que se quiere empoderar este idioma. Y eso.
Claro, yo creo que hay y yo creo que Perla lo presenta, que hay un poco de prejuicio internalizado que no lo permite a uno verlo desde ese punto de vista. Y es un trabajo que tenemos que hacer. Gracias.
Faraclas, micrófono.
Gracias, disculpa, yo había apagado todo porque, bueno, cuando se cayó el internet, entonces yo apago todo para que no interfiera demasiado. Pero no, Marisol, yo creo, Perla, un grupo que se está dando cuenta cada vez más del valor de su idioma ancestral, de sus idiomas ancestrales, sobre todo en conexión con la industria del turismo. Sería Garífuna y también Bay Islands, English o English Lexifier Creole. Está dentro de, bueno, es como parte del continuo. Entonces ahora con la industria turística en la costa caribeña de Centroamérica, yo creo que hay cada vez más gente dándose cuenta de que sí, aquellos idiomas como el limonense tienen sí un valor sí, no solamente cultural, identificario, pero también un valor en términos de identificación, pero también económico.
Claro, claro, creo que aquí en Nicaragua están muy por encima de nosotros en esa valorización que le dan al lenguaje y ese valor económico que le dan, de forma que enseñan cursos en la universidad, ¿verdad? Y yo creo que Limón va lento, pero va. Y ahí, pues, algunos grupos que están tratando esto. Así que veremos. Creo que tenemos muchos ejemplos muy buenos que podemos.
Yo creo que lo económico es bueno como estrategia para
movilizar a la comunidad.
Sí, realmente no porque tengan la intención de capitalizar el idioma, sino como estrategia para subvertir el sistema.
Claro que sí, claro que sí. Claro que sí, me parece que es... que Limonense está en proceso. Ya hay un sitio en Limón que está diseñado específicamente para el turista, pero el dueño de ese sitio tiene todos sus rótulos en criollo limonense. Todos los rótulos en criollo limonense, así que ya es un avance, porque eso está conectando el lenguaje con lo económico, que es lo que quiere la comunidad. Así que creo que estamos en proceso, proceso.
Sí. Ok, entonces, bueno, hay mucho más que discutir, pero queremos otra vez aplaudir a los y les presentadores y también pasar y también agradecerles a Manuel y a Celi por su paciencia. So Celi and Manuel, thank you for your patience. I think, Celi, how are you doing for time? Are you okay? I know you have time limitations. Would you rather go first or second?
I can go. Yeah, that's fine.
But I mean, I know that you in particular, you have scheduling things going on. Manuel is scheduled to go first, but I just want to ask.
That's fine.
Is it okay? You sure?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I cleared the hour, so.
Okay. So the first person who's going to be presenting is Manuel A. Estela Gonzalez, and he will be presenting on public perceptions of Vodun in the popular cultures of the Caribbean. Okay. Let me get that up on the screen here.
Okay. Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I'm just getting your PowerPoint up. Manuel, can you see the slides?
Not yet.
Okay, maybe they're coming.
Now I can.
Now you can, okay. Let me get this on. Okay, so Manuel, you can go ahead and let me know when you want me to change the slide.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Estera, and this is my presentation of the perceptions of voodoo in the popular culture of the Americas. Next slide, please. Voodoo have their roots in the West African religion of voodoo, varieties of which are still practiced to this day in West Africa, Haiti, and Louisiana. Alongside voodoo-influenced religious practices such as Santeria in the Spanish Caribbean, Yoruba religion in the British Caribbean, Candomblé in Brazil, among many others. In this presentation, we describe the features of voodoo, its history in the Americas, and its portrayal in popular culture. Despite marginalization and persecution of voodoo and its adherents in the Americas, African-descended peoples, most of whom were brought to Haiti and Louisiana as part of the enslaved labor force, have continued to practice voodoo, which means that despite the slave trade, that this did not mean that people gave up in their practices. They continued their practices. Voodoo, and voodoo are important elements in their practitioners' cultural identities. After a long history of persecution in the Americas, voodoo has recently gained more acceptance as a part of the culture of Haiti and Louisiana. Despite this increased acceptance, however, the negative portrayal of voodoo is still very much alive in the media. How voodoo is conceptualized worldwide through popular culture is radically different from how voodoo is experienced by its adherents. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Here are some features of voodoo. The definition of the term voodoo means spirit, and it's practiced in to this day, it's practiced in the Republic of Benin, formerly known as Dahomey, is considered to be the African source of voodoo and voodoo in the Americas. Here are a few features of the practice of voodoo, which are a recognition of the influences of ancestors and spirits of nature in people's successes and misfortunes, possession ceremonies honoring the deities, a sophisticated divination system predicting one's fate and the will of the spirits, and the use of animal sacrifice and the offering of food and drink to thank the deities or persuade them to take favorable action on one's behalf. These features were pointed out by Fallon in their article. Here is a history of voodoo in the Americas. Voodoo has been the target of persecution and marginalization in the Americas, which has had a major impact in the public portrayal and the perception of voodoo. And this has been going on for years, and it's still going. Voodoo has suffered at the hands of various colonial institutions, including the slave trade, prohibition by colonial governments, the demonization by the Catholic, Calvinist, and evangelical churches, whether it was due to colonization or sometimes even competition from these other religions. The annexation of Louisiana by the United States and the US occupation of Haiti in 1915 to 34, as noted by Concert in their article. Misrepresentations of voodoo by American occupiers created a false understanding of the society and its culture and its customs, which still exist in the United States today, according to Blue. Next slide, please. Haitian, here is some pictures of voodoo in Haiti. Haitian voodoo can be seen as a symbol of, as well as foundation for the cultural and political resistance by enslaved people of African descent, which culminated in the Haitian Revolution at the dawn of the 19th century. Voodoo as a religion in Haiti originates in the turmoiled history of slaves brought from the western coast of Africa to the island by Spanish and French colonialists. The heterogeneous group of slaves mainly originated from the west coast of Central Africa and the Bight of Benin, and was mainly made up of ethnicities such as the Yoruba, Pon, and Ewe, according to Pfeiffer. For over a decade, especially to the year 2003, the date when Voodoo religion became official in Haiti. And it's been noted that Voodoo has begun to clarify what is really derived from this mythology that has been distorted to the ridiculous by the media and history. Haitian Voodoo incorporates various aspects of Catholicism, such as images of saints and prayers. Leaders of Haitian Voodoo congregations, which make up the core of many social communities in the country, are either called Hungan, describing a male priest and a healer, or Mambo, describing a female priestess and a healer. One common saying, according to Guin in their article, is that Haitians are 70% Catholic, 30% Protestant, and 100% Voodoo. There is a yearly celebration known as the Fête Festival, which is important to the Haitian Voodoo national calendar. And it's celebrated in November 1 and November 2, the same day as the Mexican Day of the Dead and All Saints Day. Voodoo serves as an ode to Haiti's endurance, since it served as an inspiration for those that were enslaved to the French prior to 1804, according to Christina in 2020. Next slide, please. Okay. Here are some features of Voodoo in Louisiana. The New Orleans Voodoo is also known as Voodoo, Hoodoo, or Voodoo Catholicism. It is a religion connected to nature, spirits, and ancestors. The number of Voodoo practitioners in Louisiana greatly increased when plantation owners fled the Haitian Revolution, along with some of their slaves, and eventually settled in Louisiana. Many of these slaves according to the New Orleans website, many of these slaves and their descendants became free people of color who made their practice of Voodoo an important part of their culture. Historically, one of the most famed Voodoo priestesses in New Orleans was Marie Louvou. I hope I said that correctly. New Orleans Voodoo is not the same as Haitian Voodoo, and neither resembles Hollywood Voodoo. Voodoo, Southern Hoodoo, and their sister religions are the result of intense fusions that happened when people of African diaspora met Catholics and colonists in the New World, according to War. Next slide, please. Here are some features how popular culture makes perceptions of Voodoo. Popular culture in the form of television, movies, and entertainment media has generally portrayed Voodoo as in a very negative way. And Voodoo is normally stereotyping on ice, but as a form of devil worship specific to Louisiana. And there is barely any mention either of its African roots or the fact that it's also practiced in Haiti and elsewhere. And although it's usually considered important to portray something in television, this doesn't seem to be the case with Voodoo. Little attention is paid to Voodoo as a holistic religion, and instead individual elements of its practice, such as the term zombie, which originated in Haiti, which is a soul that has been captured, is artificially isolated and monstrously distorted. These days, the zombie genre is a well-known genre in television and video games. It doesn't have any elements from its source these days. Here are some examples of movies and television programs that contain Voodoo, but not Hollywood Voodoo, actually. The first is Disney's Princess and the Frog, in which portrays two characters that practice Voodoo. One is a villain who paints himself as the paintings in his face represent Baron Samedi, and Mama Odie, who is the lone benevolent voodoo figure throughout the movie. There's Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, in which voodoo is portrayed as something to restrict the movements of the characters. In 007 Live and Let Die, in which voodoo is portrayed as the villains taking advantage of the people that believe in the practices to recruit henchmen. And American Horror Story Coven, in which portrays Marie Laveau as a witch, as an immortal witch. And one of the rare cases in which voodoo is portrayed in Haiti, which is Bela Lugosi's White Zombie, in which the villain known as Murder is considered a voodoo practitioner that owns a plantation of zombies. And these are only a few of many other examples that have spanned from the 20th century to this day. There is a pressing need to change the ways in which voodoo is represented in the media, but even when attempts are made to do so, such as in Eve's Bayou, they are often half-hearted, misleading, and sensational. Now, to the next slide for the conclusion. For centuries, voodoo and the family of religions related to it have experienced persecution by colonial governments, churches, and popular media. And it's important to always be careful on to look for information that is presented in the media on this religion. An essential part of this persecution consists of a body of criticism and negative portrayals that have demonized voodoo and its practitioners in public perceptions. Despite somewhat frequent reference to it in popular culture, voodoo is misrepresented, marginalized, distorted, and sensationalized. Regardless of these obstacles, voodoo and its adherents have persevered and continued to play a vibrant role in the cultures of West Africa, in Benin, Louisiana, and Haiti, where voodoo has recently been accepted as an official religion. Here are the references. And thank you very much. That would be all for the presentation.
Also, okay, let's go right to our next presentation, which is titled Rethinking Language, Rethinking Acquisition. It's presented by Sally Thompson. I'm going to get her video, her PowerPoint up on the screen now. Sally, can you see the slides?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
can everybody
wait.
hear me okay?
Yeah, we just lost the slides 1 minute. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. Okay, great. Right. Okay, Sally, you can get started. Let me know when you want me to change the slide.
Sure, yes. So yeah, I'm Celie Thompson, and today I'm going to be exploring just kind of the concept of language as a colonial system and how that relates to language education. So you can change the slide, please. Yeah, so I just wanted to start with this quote by Dr. Faraclas. It's kind of the heart of what we're talking about today. One of the most devastating impacts of colonialism lies in what it acknowledges, valorizes, and/or centers versus what it erases, trivializes, and/or marginalizes in the dominant historical and scientific narratives that it has bequeathed to us. So basically, colonialism has played a major role in shaping a lot of our major institutions and systems, and of course, education and language are no exception. And according to Makoni and Pennycook, singular standardized languages are colonial constructs in themselves. So, you know, this monolithic idea of standardized language, or the idea that language just comes from one place, or that there's a correct way to use it, or that it belongs to one group, is really just a colonial construct. And as somebody who's been in language education, either as a learner or as a teacher for a while, coming to UPR, this is the first time I've really explored language in this way. So I do know that there's language educators out there who might need to hear this, so, which is why I decided to explore this topic. And in addition to that, the Western model of education encourages academic ways of thinking and thinking in terms of classification rather than other venues. And so in my opinion, I think a good place to start with kind of decolonizing language education is focusing on pluri-identification, deconstructing preconceived notions about language, and rethinking strategies that we use in the classroom to teach. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so I want to start with viewing languages as linguistic repertoires. So instead of calling languages languages, basically, we can accept that they are a colonial construct. And once we do that, when I say we, I mean language educators. Language educators can start to view language acquisition in more meaningful and more complex ways. So instead of focusing on teaching a language, like this is English, this is the right way to use it, this is how you'll communicate with monolingual English speakers, instead of coming from that perspective, we can come from we can think about language as a linguistic variety, which would mean that the language may come from multiple sources, not just one place or one language. And I feel like it's truly arbitrary and even potentially harmful to try to teach from the perspective of enforcing standardized communication and dismissing other ways of communication, because in real life, that's just not what we do. All right, next slide. And so I want to propose a toolkit approach. And so this kind of goes well with the idea of a linguistic repertoire. I'm kind of a visual person, so I think about the toolkit I have at my house. I have, hammers and screwdrivers or whatever. And if I want to hang a picture, well, there's a lot of ways I can do that. I can use a drill, I can use a hammer and nails. It kind of depends on, what my walls are made of, what I know how to do, what's available to me. And I think that language, and as we learn language, it can be approached in a similar way. So, learners, they have an existing repertoire of linguistic knowledge from various languages. And as they are in different communicative environments, they can acquire more methods of communications and expressions, and they can choose for themselves how they want to do that. So, and their repertoire, it could consist of different dialects, accents, cultural backgrounds, word choice. And every time that they learn something new about any language or any way to communicate, they're adding that to their toolkit or to their repertoire. And that can even happen in your own language. Like English is my native language. I learn new expressions or whatever all the time, and that gets added to my repertoire. Same as I'm learning Spanish. As I learn new things, it's added to my toolkit. And over time, learners can figure out how to use these different features, which contexts, and and they add that knowledge to their repertoire. And I want to give some specific instructional strategies, and these are just a couple, but if you are a language educator, you've probably heard of these, and you could try to kind of apply the same method to other language learning strategies. So one is front-loading language. So front-loading language is the idea that if you are teaching people in their second language or in a different language, the language instructor should teach them the necessary vocabulary or grammar or language skills to do whatever task you're going to have them do. And that is, undoubtedly a strong strategy to use in the language learning classroom. However, I think one way that we could kind of decolonize this is by actually teaching the skill of front-loading language rather than just telling students what they need to know for certain activities. Because if you actually know how to teach yourself, if students can learn how to teach themselves what they want to know or what they need to know in order to complete linguistic tasks, then first of all, that gives them autonomy. And secondly, it gives them the option to choose from either non-standardized or plurilingual linguistic concepts. And I also want to talk about linking form to function. So language function is described as the communicative task at hand, while language form refers to the tools needed to complete that task. And a few ways that we can make this a little more equitable is including time and opportunities for learners to discuss the tools that they feel are necessary for building skills to approach certain tasks. So again, instead of the teacher just being the knowledge holder and telling them what they should do, try to let the students kind of talk about what they would like, you know, what they feel is appropriate. We can also consider the learner's prior knowledge and offer opportunities for them to incorporate skills that they already have in their linguistic repertoire. So acknowledging that they do already have these toolkits full of language knowledge, linguistic knowledge. And when we are linking form to function, the functions that teachers need to use should relate to the cultural and social context of the learners, and it needs to relate to real life communicative situations. And if we're following that, we also should include opportunities for them to explore non-standardized linguistic features and non-standardized language. Okay, next slide.
Oops.
And I just briefly want to touch on cultural sensitivity and cultural competence as an ESL instructor. At least here in the United States, we are always doing workshops and stuff about this, and it's always a little bit superficial. So in my opinion, it's not enough to simply just be aware of other cultures and other viewpoints, but instead, and first of all, that's pretty like monolithic anyway, to be like, people from this place think this way or are like this. But instead, instructors need to have a real understanding of the history of colonization and how that impacts their students. And when we think about colonization, we're not just thinking about, you know, countries taking over other countries. We should think about it in terms of any time inequality is present. So, you know, men colonize women and you know, stuff like that. And historically, colonizers have supported the standardization of language in order to turn language into something that can be controlled. And, you know, that obviously elevates certain languages while suppressing others. And I think it's really important for language educators to be aware of that. And finally, learners need opportunities to be validated and to, you know, for the teachers to validate them as people who have this wide range of knowledge and skills. And as Garcia says, I love the way he says this, they shouldn't just be considered as objects trying to communicate through the eyes and tongues of white monolingual subjects. Okay, next slide. And I will offer a few concessions. I've worked in some pretty strict language learning environments. So I do know that sometimes the teachers, we have to, you know, we have certain policies or whatever we have to follow, and if we don't, we'll lose our jobs. So I do understand maybe there's standardization of curriculum or exams or rubrics, and that's, you know, so I do understand there's limitations. Maybe instructors are not able to do all of these things all the time. However, this presentation is really just supposed to be a jumping off point and to get educators thinking about these things and thinking about how they can incorporate them in their classrooms. And as Garcia says, decolonization involves transforming the colonial mindset, which is so deeply ingrained in ways of life that it often goes unnoticed. And this semester, that's true for me as a language instructor. I've needed to definitely, you know, have that type of reflection. And so, yeah, I just hope other language educators will do the same if they see this. And a few conclusions and key takeaways. So again, this presentation was created to with the intention of demonstrating that formal language education and acquisition are still very reliant and centered around colonial norms. However, if educators start to I lost the word. Okay, if educators start to acknowledge this and deconstruct this, then these systems can be at least somewhat undone with conscious effort. And once educators recognize standardized language for what it is, they can, you know, start applying that to their classrooms. And learners need agency within the language learning process. They need opportunities to pull from pluralistic concepts, and they need space to explore unstandardized linguistic varieties. And in order for language educators to truly be culturally competent, they must think of languages and cultures outside of the colonial mindset. All right. And these are my sources. Okay, thank you.
Okay, applause. Now, these are these in terms of theme, these two presentations are very different, but actually they're both talking about something that, well, at least one thing they have in common is that on the one hand, you have standardization in language, and then on the other side, you have standardization of spirituality. So in other words, Vodun has traditionally been a spiritual practice that has not been standardized. So it's very much still under the control of its practitioners. There has been some attempt to do that as it crossed the Atlantic, and we have an excellent thesis by Nelsa Rodriguez Montemoino, which actually talks about how that happened from Africa to the Caribbean, how not Vodun specifically, but Santeria gets gendered as it goes across the Atlantic, and how that could be seen actually as a process of standardization and an instrument of control over the religion and its practitioners. And then of course, Celi is talking about how language, standard forms of language are used in education as a means of control as well. Okay, so comments and questions from those who are here? I think that there's a little bit of feedback from, I think it's your microphone, Dannabang. Is there a way for you to mute? Can you mute? If you can't, don't worry, just stay on and wait. Yeah, okay, I think that took care of the problem, right? Good, thank you, Dannabang. Thank you, Professor Kuwabong. Okay, any questions or comments? Questions or comments?
I have one, Professor.
Yes, Elvin.
It's for Celi. Celi, how would you negotiate, since it's about teaching, how would you negotiate the institutional aspects like lesson planning and the curricular maps? Would you like a bit disingenuously like write whatever on paper and then in real life in the classroom give what the students need? How would you like deal with that?
I think that kind of depends on your workplace. I know in the past I've worked in some really kind of toxic workplaces where it was like very standardized, and if they found out that you were like going off curriculum at all, it was very like you were gonna have to go talk to somebody, basically, go to the office. So, you know, I do understand the limitations with that. I've also been in very like I've been in teaching situations where they're kind of like, do whatever you want. And those have been, I think, where that was where we got to explore a lot of unstandardized language. And that's where I got to teach kind of like Southern English to my students because, you know, they were living in the Southeast and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to tell anybody to do anything that could make them lose their jobs. But I think even in very standardized educational situations, I do think there's always a little bit of room. So that's really what my presentation is about, is kind of like do what you can. You know, it'd be nice to just fix the whole system, but realistically, that's, you know, I don't know. But hopefully if more educators take that approach, maybe we can. I don't know. So sorry, that may not be the best answer, but.
More questions or comments? Just one?
Yeah, Celi. I don't know if you already took the course of Faraclas, Language and Power.
No, this was my first semester at UP.
Oh,
yeah.
In that course, Faraclas talk about the standardization of language, and also critica el concepto de you talk about competence, and I don't know. I recommend to you that to all of you that course. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
More questions and comments. Any questions and comments for Manuel and Vodun? Well, I will ask a question, and if nobody else has a question, let me get my camera up. Okay, Manuel, are you familiar with the religions in Puerto Rico of Santeria and Espiritismo?
The first, I was familiar with Espiritismo because I had some family members that actually did practice Espiritismo, but we converted to Catholic, but none of my families would dare speak to me about it. But Santeria was one I actually heard about more recently.
Yeah.
It was surprising.
Yeah. What did you find surprising about it?
The secrecy. I didn't even know that these were religions, and whenever I heard about Spiritismo, sorry, it was always negative portrayals or to stay away from it.
Yeah. So
the same thing happened with what I knew about voodoo. I didn't even know it was a religion until recently.
And you know, even to this whole idea of religion, and to call something a religion, it's like calling something a language. So when Sally was talking about this whole idea of language is a colonial construct. So what happens when a country is colonized or a community is colonized? Then you get academics coming in and they start assigning languages to people. So they say, oh, in this place they speak this language, in that place they speak that language. That's a very colonial thing to do, because the people may not see themselves actually as speaking separate language. They may see themselves as speaking a range of different varieties and repertoires that don't have those boundaries that have been imposed by colonialism. And you could probably say the same thing for religion as well, because in other words, sometimes, for example, in Puerto Rico, the boundaries between different religions may not be so clear to the people who actually practice those religions as they are to the people who talk about those religions in the university or something like that. Because I know that there are people in Puerto Rico who don't see a very clear line between Catholicism and Santeria, for example, or even between Santeria and Espiritismo. So in other words, it's not all these neat religions and these neat little packages. It's about spiritual experience and spiritual repertoires and spiritual varieties, and that people can go from one to the other. And I think you mentioned this in your presentation, especially for Vodun, the boundary between Vodun and Catholicism sometimes is for people who practice Vodun, it's not a clear-cut boundary. What would you say to that?
I feel like the boundary depends on, well, it depends on its treatment, but and how it coexists with the other with other religions. The thing about voodoo is that it's experienced a lot of persecution from the other religions, but people, like in the quote that I put in the presentation, that people are this certain percentage of each religion, but 100% voodoo. So
yeah, so
it's possible that the religion might coexist. It's possible that the religion might coexist.
They do. I mean, if in Haiti, you say 70% of the people are Catholic, 30% are Protestant, 100% are Vodou, people must be practicing at least two religions, or they must have a repertoire that includes practices that are associated with Catholicism and then practices that are associated as well with Vodou in Haiti. And I think that actually, if you look at spiritual practices around the world, this idea of religion is a very recent idea, that you can actually take those practices and sort of put them in a box. Because if you look at, for example, Christianity, okay, the only way they were able to make Christianity a religion that appealed to people when the Christianity first started was to blur the lines between Christianity and other religions. So for example, the Virgin Mary is part of a worship of goddesses that happened a long time before there was ever Christianity. And in order for the Christian church to reach the people who believed in those goddesses, they had to create a veneration of the Virgin Mary. So that shows that even in Christianity, you have these memories, these traces of practices from before Christianity that people never gave up really, and that Christianity had to make a compromise with. And so, yeah, I think that what you are saying about Vodun is very much that. What is the relationship between Vodun and the Catholic Church? There's a very, the Catholic Church had to make compromises with Vodun. And Vodun also made compromises with the Catholic Church. Santeria as well, you can see those kinds of compromises in the way the Santos are represented. So it's kind of half very European Catholic, at least on the surface, but then you've got this really West African tradition. But on top of that is a very indigenous one. So especially in Santeria, you can see a lot of indigenous elements. The use of tobacco, the use of different visual things that actually are not so much West African or European, but actually more indigenous. So all of that's happening. And so you can see that that repertoire, plurivarietal repertoire approach happening as well in religion there. But I'm just wondering about Espiritismo, because in Espiritismo, do you see those kind of cross influences happening as well from your knowledge of it from your family?
The thing is that all knowledge of Espiritismo died with another member of my family. So they barely ever mention. They sometimes mention the Virgin Mary in Espiritismo, but they tend to avoid talking about it a lot.
Yeah. Okay. And then when you're talking about the persecution and the way it's demonized and sensationalized in the media, that could also be seen as a way to establish boundaries. So if people in their practice won't obey and conform to and acknowledge boundaries that the religions are trying to put up between themselves and these practices, then one way to get people to obey those boundaries, to allow themselves to be enclosed by those boundaries, is to demonize the other religion. So I think part of how Voodoo is, part of the reason why Voodoo has been so sensationalized and demonized is because it's the only way that established religions can get people to actually create those boundaries. And in your family, they succeeded. So the Catholic religion, by demonizing things like Espiritismo, they convinced your family to actually create a boundary, a firm boundary between Espiritismo and Catholicism that your family now, to the point where your family won't even talk about it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that
is a good point.
Yeah, demonization and othering is a lot of the reasons behind it is about establishing these kinds of boundaries. Okay, so back and Sally, wait, before I keep talking, did anybody else have anything that they wanted to say? Comments and questions for Sally and her presentation on language standardization and new approaches to teaching language.
Yo tenía un comentario, pero era pequeñito. A Manuel.
Sí.
A Manuel y para todo el mundo, pero quizás se aleja un poquito. Y es que estaba pensando en el caso de mi familia, que es católica. Entonces, si vamos a la historia que estaba comentando, que tú comentas, que comentó hoy Ana, y comentamos Malu y yo, la gente que llegó de la península ibérica era gente gitana y musulmana. y romaní, que practicaban un catolicismo que era distinto, supongo yo, ¿no? Un catolicismo gitano, muchos de los casos. Entonces, estaba pensando en mi mamá, que practica un catolicismo, pero obviamente tiene a la Virgen María como principal, va por encima de Cristo, y que incluye otras cosas como las supersticiones de muchas cosas y otras como otras formas de ver el catolicismo. Que yo creo que también, más allá de decir como que el catolicismo como algo malo, que es, bueno, sí es malo, pero también vino como con muchas otras, o sea, tuvo contacto con estas otras religiones, pero pero otro tipo de catolicismo, no sé, como más rebelde quizás.
Sí, sí. Entonces, es que si tú no obedeces, si tú no reconoces estas divisiones entre prácticas espirituales, entonces eso te permite ver aquellas prácticas como, como tal como son, en vez de cómo se presentan en los discursos dominantes. Entonces, por eso tú puedes evitar demonizar o pensar en términos binarios, que una religión es buena, otra es mala, etcétera, etcétera. Porque bueno, es que, como hemos dicho en la mañana, que puede ser que la religión católica ha hecho mucho daño. Bueno, es seguro que ha hecho mucho daño, pero hay mucha gente que practica su catolicismo de una manera bien buena, abierta, humana, que corresponde a las necesidades de su pueblo, de su familia, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, una vez que empezamos a empaquetear prácticas religiosas en conceptos bien delimitados y binarísticas, binarios, entonces allá empieza el problema.
En mi familia, por ejemplo, mi mamá y mi papá quitaron del catolicismo la confesión. So, tú no tienes que confesarte en ninguna parte para tú liberarte de tus pecados. Como que no, reza y pídele perdón a Dios y ya está bien, no tienes que ir a confesarte. No se promovió ir a confesarte donde el sacerdote. Y yo creo que son actos súper rebeldes.
Okay, I want to hear from English teachers. Okay, so we have lots of English teachers in this group, I think. Okay, do you have any comments or questions on Celi's presentation? Okay, what do you think about this idea of getting away from the idea of language? So there is no such thing as an English language. There's no such thing as a Spanish language. Okay, it's impossible to think of languages as separate concepts and separate boxes. So in other words, we can talk about language as a set of linguistic practices. In other words, we can say that all languages have vowels. Okay, you can say that, but you can't. But really, when you start talking about an English language or a Spanish language or a Limonese Creole language, then you're falling into a trap. You're falling into a trap of actually taking language and making it something that moves further and further away from how people actually use it, and closer and closer and closer to how a ruling class uses it for domination. And how do you apply that in your classroom?
Professor.
Yes.
I think that's such a great question, and I'm thankful that you reiterated some of the points that Celi made, because I was listening to the presentation, but I was also driving, and so sometimes like you're hearing, but you're not able to completely focus. So I'm thankful that you were able to sum up at least some of her points, and I would definitely say that one of the things I would say that when you do those kinds of practices like she's talking about, and you address language as different repertoires, and you kind of like try to show that these distinctions are actually very blurry, I think that empowers the students, because for so long, students
Okay, turn off your videos.
on them, even language. And you know, what happens is that it's almost like language is, you know, you have to, students are being forced to do these linguistic practices that are not natural. And then on top of that, when they have to learn a second language in their country, like here in Puerto Rico, then on top, and then when they're being criticized about how they're learning that second language, and criticized about whether they even know their own first language, supposedly. So it's almost like the language is constantly being used as a method of domination, and which is, I know what you guys have been saying. And I think that when you start to bring it in this other perspective, the way that Sally and you were talking, Professor, it's a type of liberation for the student to feel like, wait a minute, instead of the language being on top of them, always banging them on the head, they can kind of get above language and see from above the clouds everything that's happening around them, and then have a very different perspective. And I think that's very empowering.
And once you get that kind of power, then you can do what Josué's parents did. In other words, you can say, well, I don't agree with confession, so I'm not going to do it. So you can take control over your spiritual practices, and instead of letting those practices control you, you can start to remake those practices in your own image and your own interest. Anna has her hand up.
Yes, but I had more of a comment for Manuel's presentation.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask, like, if you found any positive representations of voodoo in the media, because there's this interesting secondary stereotypical trope, which is the magical Black character, and it works in aid of the protagonist, which is usually a white person. If you found any like positive representation, or like something that could stand on its own, if it was anything that you came across.
You know, there was one, but I believe it was Mama in Disney's Princess and the Frog, Mama, but she appears in a small part of the movie. The Mama Odie is a magical character that, unlike Dr. Facilier, who Dr. Facilier, who is a villain and cares only about money and ruling over all of New Orleans, Mama Odie teaches the protagonist to appreciate what they have and what they want may be in front of them. But when it comes to voodoo, it's usually just played as the most common instances of voodoo in popular culture that I found were usually negative.
So, and it sounds like actually even this one character that's positive was had a minor part, and she was counseling a person who was portrayed as a person of European descent in the movie, right? Is the princess? What color
no,
is
she is the Mama Odie is a person of color who I believe was
I'm talking
over
about
100 years. Oh.
I'm talking about the princess.
The princess was also lived in New Orleans, who was a person of color. She's
a person of color. So here's an exception to what you were talking about, Anna. So Anna, here you have a person of color being the protagonist, and then this person who has an association with Vaudou, counseling her with positive advice. So that breaks with that other pattern that you were talking about, where the main star of the show is, of course, of European descent, and then if there is a person who plays a semi-heroic role, it's always a secondary character of African descent. But here you actually have a person of color as the star of the show, and a person of color associated with Vaudou as a person who aids that person. But you also, unfortunately, have another character of African descent who is evil and is also associated with Vaudon through Baron Samedi. Okay, anyway, that was really, really interesting. And unfortunately, we have to go on to our next set of presenters. So our first presenter will be Itza M. Hernandez Jonavetti, and she'll be talking about the empowering role of Puerto Rican women in the music industry. And let me get your PowerPoint up on the screen. Itza. Here you are. Can you see the PowerPoint, Itza?
Yes, I can see it. It's still not in full projection mode.
It's coming. Okay, can you see it now in PowerPoint mode or in slideshow mode?
Yes, it's already full screen.
Okay, Itza, could you let me know when you want me to change the slides, please?
Okay, yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. So like the professor said, my name is Itza, and I'm going to be talking about the empowering role of Puerto Rican women in the music industry. Okay, next slide. Okay, so as we all know, we live in a pretty much patriarchal society. However, some women in the Puerto Rican music industry are fighting against this patriarchy by using their voices to shed light on issues such as domestic violence, taboos regarding menstruation, and freedom of the female body. So I looked at 3 artists specifically. These were Ile, Andrea Cruz, and Plena Combativa, which is a group, an all-women group that sings plena, that plays plena. And they are redefining what it's like to be a woman in this day and age through their music. So their music challenges the norms in order to construct alternative mental models that empowers marginalized and oppressed groups. So by mental models, we're referring to what we use to understand and remember the world. Next slide. Okay, so here is our first example. Ile is her performance name, her stage name, I guess we could say, but her actual name is Ileana Cabra. She's also known as PG-13 from the group Calle 13. She released her first solo album called Inevitable in May 2016, and later on she released her second album called Almadura in May 2019. And I read some interviews where she talked about the goal she had with this album, and I have a really interesting quote that I wanted to mention. It says, "I just wanted to be defiant. I had a lot of anger when I was writing these songs, so I didn't want to be too poetic. I just wanted to be direct and defiant to patriarchy itself." So we can see how she came up with these songs to specifically with the intention of talking about different current issues that were happening on the island, and that she found very relevant in order to promote these different mental models where oppression of women is not accepted. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I looked at specifically one of her songs. It's called Temes, and this song tackles domestic violence and sexual assault towards women. So in the music video, we can see how Ile is singing to the audience directly. She's singing to the audience directly as she's lying on the floor after just being raped. And the lyrics of the song really question machismo and how it results from men being afraid to lose their power. And at the same time, she poses questions such as, why do you fear me? ¿Por qué me temes? Which serves as an encouragement to all women to reclaim the respect they deserve. So with this song, Ile also raises awareness about rape and commands the attention of people who have yet to comprehend the severity of this issue. So we can see how she's using her music and her platform in general to really highlight that these issues need to be solved. Okay. Next slide. Okay, our next example is Andrea Cruz. She released her first album called Tejido de Laurel in 2017. And I also looked up some interviews with the artist, and I was really interested in how, well, I'm going to read the quote for you. It says, "I am in an evolutionary and awakening stage. My ideas are clear, and I want to use my space to capture provoking experiences and touch on topics that deserve visibility." So we can see how this singer is also using her music to deliver the message that that promotes women as well, we're going to see it in the next example, that pretty much in her case, she's trying to normalize different situations that happen to women, such as menstruation. So on to the next slide. So she released her single called Vengole in February 2019, which she describes as poetry to menstruation, actually, because it's a song that talks openly about this natural process. And she thinks, I'm going to read her quote, it says, I think these are terms and topics that should not be controversial, that should not be taboo anymore. So again, she's trying to normalize these situations. And we can see that as well in the music video. So throughout the music video, Andrea Cruz is singing, and we also see her experiencing period cramps while she's getting ready in the morning. Again, making sure that the audience understands that this is a natural process that everybody goes through. We also see that they use rose petals to symbolize the blood during the music video, and the song lyrics also include different elements from nature, which capture the beauty of menstruation, further implying that menstruation is a natural and normal part of being a woman. Okay, next slide. In addition to releasing the song, she also organized an event to celebrate the release of the song. The event was called Poetry of Our Blood, La Poesía de Nuestra Sangre. It took place on March 10th, 2019. And the purpose of this event was to have a day dedicated to learning about the menstrual cycle, how to enjoy it, and how to manage it healthily. So we can see how this artist is not using only her music, but also her influence as an artist to promote, to encourage people to learn about these topics. So basically to encourage and educate. Okay, next slide. And then finally, we have our last example. It's Plena Combativa. Like I mentioned, it's an all-women Plena group composed of 6 members. We have the names of the members up on the screen, right above the picture. So according to one of the interviews that I read, this group is one of the few all-women groups performing the Puerto Rican folk musical tradition on the island, which is very significant, right? We have that female representation in that area. They released their first album in 2020, which made them the first full group composed of women to produce a record in Puerto Rico, another very noteworthy fact. And when they were talking about what motivated them and to compose these songs, they expressed in an interview, I'm going to quote them, it says, "It's very important to bring women together to tackle all the things that we face on a daily basis." So again, we can see how they're using their platform to really talk about what it's like to be a woman in this day and age. Next slide. The song that I specifically looked at, it's called Libre y Peligrosa, and it's a protest against patriarchy and advocates for the freedom of women to have a say over their own bodies. So they include phrases like, "I don't leave my house to fulfill your expectations," "I don't think I will stand idly," and many, many more phrases in order to encourage women to assert and fight for their autonomy. They see their songs as a tool for fighting, protesting, and denouncing the patriarchal system, racism, capitalism, heteronormativity, colonialism, and its violence against women and the LGBTIAQP+ communities. And it's really significant that they chose Plena as their way of doing this because, as we know, Plena is a male-dominated genre, and it's rooted in African song and dance. And it was originally used to talk about social issues affecting Puerto Rico way back when it was created. So it's really interesting that they chose this as their medium for doing so. Okay, next slide. And well, in conclusion, we see that instead of accepting the dominant discourses of patriarchy, these women have been creating music that defies those discourses. So by creating these alternative mental models where important social issues are made visible, they are empowering others to look at reality from a different perspective. So that is something that we should all keep in mind. Okay, and those are my sources, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Okay, now our next presentation, I will have time for questions and comments later, is by Elvin Ramos Munoz, and the title is The Economic Dimensions of Queerness in Caribbean Cinema. So I'll get that up on the screen here. Can you see it, Elvin?
Me?
Yeah.
when I was at the school with you and you were the teacher, you were the best teacher there.
Oh, and you were the best student there. You were the best student there. Okay, Elvin, can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay,
I can.
just tell me when to change it.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elvin Ramos, and I'm going to be talking about queerness in cinema from an economic perspective. If at any point I'm not audible, just let me know, and I'll log back in. I've been doing that all day, so here we go. The slide. Okay, we're going to have a short overview of queerness in the region, and then I'll focus on a Cuban, Trinidadian, and Dominican film. So the slide. Okay, one way of gleaning queerness in the region is through documentaries. So we have Of Men and Gods, which illustrates how voodoo spirituality provides queer folk with spaces for social empowerment, including economic stability. So that's an aspect of voodoo that that documentary really excels at. And then the Puerto Rican Mala Mala, where we have a range of drag performers and trans people, all these queer voices that are not harmonious, right? If anything, it's a collage of disharmony, which is kind of interesting because I think that's part and parcel of what queer theory is. So we don't have one narrative that takes over the entire documentary. I would also add that from a legal perspective, in Jamaica, we still have a 19th century law that prohibits so-called buggery, so anal sex. In Trinidad, there's the Immigration Act of 1974, which doesn't allow homosexuals to immigrate. It puts it in a category like prostitutes. It's literally in the language, the legal language. In St. Lucia, we have cases where gay tourists receive more protection than actual St. Lucians. And for the purposes of my economic framework here, Dominicans who engage in sex work often hide their activity, whereas Cubans, quite interestingly, try to integrate the, as it were, client into their own families. In other words, to get them to purchase things for the family. So it's kind of queer kinship in Cuba. But in the films that we'll see, there's a reversal there. The slide, thank you. So the first film is Viva, a Cuban film. It's the story of Jesus, a young man living on his own in Cuba who gets by doing hairdressing jobs. He begins to participate in drag performance, partly for economic reasons, partly for self-realization. And during one of his shows, Angel, his father, who's been treated as dead, appears, and the performance goes awry. Angel then forbids Jesus from performing and commandeers Jesus' apartment. This leads Jesus to end up in sex work, which Angel doesn't know about. And eventually, oh, by the way, there'll be spoilers throughout. Eventually, Angel receives a fatal diagnosis and dies, but happily not before accepting Jesus as a gay man and a drag performer. So I'm going to focus now, the slide, thank you. I'm going to focus now on specific scenes, right? So the impetus for Jesus' first act of sex work involves Angel's midlife tantrum, where he hurls meager food Jesus brings to the ground. The horror in Jesus' face during this outburst reveals the emotional climax needed to address the root issue of economic helplessness. The immediate scene that follows this outburst has Jesus fidgeting at the oceanfront Malecon, which is a hotspot for sex work. And tellingly, the first sex scene occurs off-screen. Then I'm going to focus on a particularly shocking scene. We have a series of shots where Jesus is at night in Havana. The setting is of nightlife, chill colors steeped in urban sensibility, a kind of devil-may-care attitude of exploring an uncharted city. The shots show Jesus impatiently or anxiously waiting for a customer. The scene shifts quickly to Jesus on a bed, his hair yanked by an older white tourist. The sound of Jesus' moans of shocked pain rather than pleasure mingle with the recognizable sound of testicles flapping against flesh. The mise-en-scène is revealing. A bare room, darkened, a bed lacking its trappings, and the disciplinary feel of the prison pervades the atmosphere. The movements are brutal, violent, and the grinning tourist blurs as the focus moves towards his strained countenance. it kind of conjures the image of rape, right? Now, drag is agency. Towards the end of the film, after his father embraces Jesus' drag shows, Jesus performs one last time. The music to El Amor begins as the viewer sees Jesus in drag. The wig arranged stylishly, white dress, elbow-length gloves, but more than the clothing, there's a visual fire, a spirit unleashed on the audience. As Jesus mimics the words to El Amor, the depths of his pain are rendered visible, audible, and palpable. His body movements capture the pain of prostitution, the pain of his father's choices, the pain of gay life in Cuba, only to be metamorphosed, very much like Jesus' body, into an outburst of love, a love for the body, a love for the father, a love for the queer self, and maybe for Cuba itself. The next slide. The second film is Play the Devil. From Trinidad, it's about a young student named Gregory who is working to earn a scholarship. And in order to study medicine, he meets a wealthy businessman, James, who gradually integrates himself into the adolescent's life. The relationship is structured by a power imbalance due to the economic and age differences. Sex between them lets Gregory into an emotional spiral, and James' insistence on continuing the relationship ultimately results in his death during Carnival. The slide. So at their first meeting, James invites the young protagonist to an after-theater gathering, and Gregory declines because he has no transportation. Nonchalantly, James dismisses this and agrees to drive him back home. This first encounter also foreshadows the economic element that will heavily impact their relationship. On the ride back, Gregory shares that he has a passion for photography, but only uses his phone, lacking a camera. Later, James lends his own camera to Gregory, an inducement for emotion. After they have sex for the first time, Gregory rejects the camera when offered again, aware of the power disparity between them. When confronting James about his intentions, Gregory specifically mentions his own poverty as a negative factor. This slide. So later in the film, James arrives at Gregory's home uninvited. He speaks to Gregory's grandmother and offers to fix the leaking roof. James specifically wants to see the former lover's room, a small space. The space becomes a visual means of measuring the inequalities between them. Furthermore, James finances community and cultural activities in Trinidad. These economic activities provide him with a veneer of heteronormativity on a social level, while giving him on a personal level advantages to manipulate Gregory. So it shouldn't surprise the audience that when Gregory accidentally kills James, the latter's corpse is placed in a stylish car and the vehicle is allowed to go over a cliff. The destroyed car symbolizes the rupture of James' hold over Gregory's life, both materially and symbolically. The slide. So the last film is Dólares de Arena, Dominican film, the first one in this presentation about lesbians. It's about a young Dominican woman named Noélie and her relationship to an elderly French woman named Anne. They have been together for 3 years. Noélie, however, has a boyfriend. When Anne discovers this, the relationship temporarily ends. They decide to go to France, but Noélie decides to remain in the Dominican Republic after her boyfriend asks her to stay. The love triangle from beginning to end is complicated by economic factors. The slide. So the first scene, Noélie appears and has her walking hand in hand with a male French tourist. He is leaving the Dominican Republic and she tellingly requests for money as a parting gift. She gets a chain. The scene frames the film, establishing an economic structure to the whole narrative. An early intimate scene has Noélie and Anne naked in bed. Anne asks how much Noélie's body is worth in a playful manner, and Noélie responds somewhat dryly, 16.25. It's as though Anne's unconscious speaks, stating the economic core of their relationship, while she consciously labels it love. Money also structures Noélie's relationship with her Dominican boyfriend. She uses Anne's funds to support him. When a discussion on Noélie's possible trip to Paris takes place, the boyfriend says that Noélie still has to keep sending money to him. This makes clear that Noélie's relationships, both the real and false one, are linked inextricably to money. The slide. So just as Noélie said to go to Paris, the boyfriend asks her to stay. Noélie sneaks out in the early hours, stealing money and even a credit card from Anne. She kisses Anne and caresses her hair. It is a parting gesture, denoting tenderness. Nevertheless, she leaves because of her feelings for her actual partner. So that I would argue that Dólares de Arena, money structures the relationship, but does not fully condition it. Noélie's feelings for Anne are rich and complex, hidden even from her boyfriend. So the next slide. So in way of summarizing, Viva addressed the issues of identity and acceptance in a father-son relationship in light of the economic imperatives and consequences of both Jesus' desire to perform in drag as well as his less than enthusiastic involvement in sex work. Play the Devil is about Gregory's struggles with his sexuality as he wards off James' advances under pressure from both the economic and age asymmetries between them. Dólares de Arenas unpacks the transactional structure of romantic relationship, both queer and heterosexual. These three works illustrate the economic dimensions of queerness in Caribbean cinema, and it helps us to understand how sex work, escort-like relationships, and age money disparities often frame how queerness is experienced in the region. So that's my time. The references are to follow. Thank you.
Okay. Applause. Okay, we've now come to our last presentation. Our last presentation will be by Professor Dannabang Kuwabong, and it's titled Vestiges of Memories, Place as Historical Cultural Consciousness in the Poetry of Horace Goddard. I'll project that up on the screen. I hope that the issues have been resolved with your computer or your telephone. Professor Kuwabong, are you there?
Now, yeah, I'm here.
Okay, you're there. Okay, good. And can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll just follow the slides with your reading.
Yes. In The Awakening and Song of the Antilles and the Journey Home, Afro-Caribbean Canadian Horace Goddard engages dream memories to recuperate ancestral homelands from the spatio-temporal ruins of history. These places, especially the transnational diasporic spaces and places he has transited and imagined, transcend territorialized landscapes. He begins by appropriating the words of St. John in Revelations 22:1. Quote, and he showed me a pure river, water of life, clear as a crystal proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb, to foreground a personal odyssey. A personal, I can't see the rest.
A personal and collective?
A personal and collective vision in the awakening. And the journey home and frames his poetic explorations of the fluidity of Arawakan, African, Caribbean, and Canadian spiritual and cultural landscapes. There are constant paradigm shifts caused by instinctual anxiety of amnesia in search of stable spatial temporalities within his people's nomadicity, where revisionary histories of imagined homelands are possible through webs of translingual, transethnic, transcultural, and trans-religious alliances. Next. Instinctual anxiety generates feelings of homelessness, which in turn facilitates the temptation to create, quote, static, wishful, and willful in nature poetry, Brathwaite 2014. No, 214. To resist this, Goddard, transnational poet hero, searches for rooted places to map out and construct routinary zones of rootedness. The Pan-African world, imagined or romanticized, offers the seeker the vast possibilities for this project. Yet the reality he meets in these Pan-African geographies are often unsettling as they contradict his image, his imagined ideal. There is no memory or recognition of his ancestral trauma of the transatlantic slave trade. There is no cultural, linguistic, or religious recognition between him and continental Africans, and his own touristic and romanticized preconceptions of a non-existent Africa throws him off guard. Nonetheless, it still shows him embracing these treacherous transnational cultural roots that he can envision the possibility of remembering and the psycho-spiritual fragmentations caused by the inhuman translocation and enslavement of his African and Arawakan ancestors. Next. The anxiety of placelessness echoes George Laming's position as articulated in The Pleasures of Exile. Laming contemplates, I have lost my place, or my place has deserted me. This may be the dilemma of the West Indian writer abroad, that he hungers for nourishment from a soil which he could not at present endure. Lamin Goddard claims this paradox of his own exile as beneficial. He can belong wherever he is. His role has neither to do with time and change nor with geography, and yet there is always an acre of ground in the world which keeps growing echoes in his head. But to write in these exilic spaces and temporalities, as Marlene Obiseflip argues, is to write on the margins of history, in the shadow of empire, and on the founder of silence, against the grain as an unembedded, disappeared poet and writer in Canada, from a place of multiple identities, Black African descended, immigrant or interloper, and Caribbean, all attracting nuanced and open hostilities. Next. Nonetheless, Goddard constructs sensitive identities within his transitory locations through language, through a particular connectedness with a particular geographical locale, or through the understanding and acceptance of a particular historical experience. Philip further claims that as poets, we often create and dwell each within our spirit country. This guides Goddard's poetic through his fragmented histories, landscapes, and cultures. In The Flight, Goddard uses poetry to remember his people's vestiges of ancestral memory. Those historical memories serve as raw materials for the recreation of the worlds from the shards of old worlds, Africa, Europe, Asia, and pre-Columbian America. Poetry is the love glue with which the poet mends, the fragmented memory, the armature that frames the god, even the right of, okay, let me open my own because I can't see the end of the lines. The right surrenders a final pie. Walcott claims then that poetry is one of the excavation and of self-discovery. The buried languages and cultures of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean holds true for Goddard. Next. Hello. Am I lost again? Hello?
Continuing there, Professor.
Oh, is Professor who is lost? Or I'm lost again?
Don't worry, we're here. It's beautiful.
No, but okay. Goddard appropriates the fragments of an old and epic vocabulary from Africa to an ancestral and aesthetic rhythm in the blood that cannot be subdued by slavery. His poetry refracts from Walcott's prophetic claim that the basis of the Antillian poet's experience is underscored by, quote, the shipwreck of fragment that constantly astonish African Caribbean poets and energize creativity. Goddard's experience of his African Caribbean history, culture, and cosmology inform his conceptual frame to redefine Blackness, not just in physiognomic dimensions, but also as historical experience and memory. Blackness, he poeticizes, is a signifier of historical suffering endured by Afro-descendants. Thus, Blackness is not an alien concept or experience to him. Quote, Black is native to me, like my past, which is unknown. Black is the present. It sprouts and is encoded in multiple and patterns of racialized scarring of African-descended peoples lodged in ancestral memories. Black is stripped on my father's back. No, black is striped on my father's back and mother's sagging, aging breast, filtered through the imaginary genealogical narratives by the Black grandmother and memorialized through instinctual racial twilight vestiges of memory. This is Goddard's inverted tale, or a bandage of ignorance. As inverted tales, they are rhetorically revolutionary in their sound and fury, but culturally static wishful, and willful in nature. Also, though they may reveal a significant instinct for Africa, yet the instinct is based on ignorance, often on received European notions of an inferior Africa. Goddard problematizes the sanitized and romanticized Afrocentric ideologies promoted by African diaspora groups that deny or erase the historical roles of African kings in the trans-Saharan and the transatlantic slave trades. In his vision, the poet Griot saw the chief sell his brother for trinkets, booze, and silver. This clamor to return to an imaginary Africa is problematic. Quote, here in the Western diaspora, children ask to be sent back to Africa, unaware that the Africa of their imagination based on a reductionist illusion of selective historical memory. Their very existence is defined by what Goddard, by what Glosson in Poetics of Relations labels as errantry or circular nomadicity generated by histories of forced translocations and cultural erasures. Thus, any uncritical ideation of Africa as home, where the scars of history will be erased, is a delusional performance of selective memory. Nonetheless, Goddard acknowledges that these illusory retentions still encapsulate liberatory revisions of forms found in Carib songs, calypso, banjo, and bongo. The Journey Home, Village Mother. These forms and Carib Congo songs create liminal spaces to cope with post-traumatic slave syndromes. And the Congo drums in his ears does not just beat rhythm, it echoes the blood bounce and beats against a black wall of blackness and transported dreaming children, Afro-descendientes to enslavement first in the slave markets in West Africa, second on Caribbean plantations. Recovery and healing from historical trauma is better conceived and birthed through the creative arts. Music is one of the various art forms engaged in the Caribbean to do this. Not surprisingly, Goddard sees pan music with its clashing metal sounds as a recall of the neck braces that held Brother. Still, pan music opens psychoacoustic and artistic spaces for enslaved Africans and their descendants. Quote, determine music to liberty. However, the contemporary commoditization, this English language is a problem, of this music in the tourism industry reverses the gains made by those who invented pan to resist enslavement. The speaker also laments the erasure of consciousness of how slavery and colonization erases African Carib mother tongues, leaving only the language of anguish, psychosis, anxiety, and self-hate, and the disempowerment. To counter this, the poet agitates for decolonization of Caribbean educational systems. A second step toward healing is a conscious act of forgiveness of continental African ancestors who engaged in the sale of other Africans into slavery by descendants of those sold into slavery. This response procedure will achieve the cultural and psycho-spiritual transformations of the past into potential visions of healing and restoration. Aligned to this vision is the air spirit, recall of the lamentations of captured African ancestors as their children, as they are loaded into dugout African canoes and transported to waiting European slave ships on the coast of West Africa en route to the Caribbean. Quote, my sons, these choices of trading you to the fields of far, of lands were not easy to make. The air spirit asks forgiveness for those African ancestors, ancestral mothers, fathers, and kings who sold their children to the slavers, because he claims the captives had been oblivious to the mea culpas of their consanguineous relatives that sold them off. This acknowledgement of the double traumas caused by the transatlantic slave trade is a prerequisite for contrition before forgiveness, and healing is initialized on all sides of the Black Atlantic. Without the rituals of confession and forgiveness, contrition and forgiveness, the wounds and pains of despair manifest in the music of jazz, blues, gospel, reggae, rock, etc., created to bear my sad songs back home, will not have an effect. These disrupt the anxiety of beingness and embolden them to appropriate Yahweh's boast. My ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than earth, so are my ways higher than yours. Thus, prophets of African spirituality predate the prophets of the, what's the word?
Bible.
What?
The Bible, the prophets of the Bible?
Yeah, the Bible traveled by Midnight Express. Right. This side of Horeb, I slept by the river Jordan. The errantry depicted here is synonymous with the ways of the ancient prophets who, quote, roamed the deserted Nubian and swam with the Pharaoh in the Nile. Before Joseph's cornfield dream, I spoke in the purring wind. The poet hence tracks Christian spirituality to Africa, not Europe, or traces Christian spirituality to Africa, not Europe. Errantry as nomadicity transforms the multivariant rhythms and messages of ancestral despair into syncopated languages of liberation. In Memoriam, he declares, there is a rainbow, a happy glow of ebony line, which refuses erasure in the midst of the white mast. This is a resistance to mental whitening that ideologically
imprisons
imprisons his people in the European Enlightenment lie of their inferiority from slavery times to the present. Mothers wailing, fathers echoing, children wanting freedom, even as the earth yielding a self-seeking superiority. Paradoxically, the cantor's own patriarchal predisposition blinds him from recognizing his condescension, Black women, and his call to them not to worship foreign gods, but to return and drink again from the Nile and the Niger. Yet women are not singled out as the only consumers of Lethean waters, because he declares that women possess the power of African spiritual retention, what he calls the calabashes of liberation for his people under new colonial bondage. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, bondage encoded in Black gospel, and from which he reconstructs rough-hewn memories of my ancestors' daily prayer and craft his survival from her decaying bosom. Achieving this entails ritual summoning of the fleshless God ancestral shapes. He invites them to visit with me, help me to dig my thoughts from this permafrost. His foremother, Lillian, whose spirit animates these dumb catacombs, offers her sarcophagus on her back to effectuate the speaker's evocative abilities to break his silence. Lillian's long memory of the trauma of slavery is permanent, not even Serge Bushti could purge it, could not purge it. Even so, the cantor is painfully aware of the widening cultural distances between him and his island and his Arawak African Carib ancestral bonds. He invokes the old woman, broken mother, who returns once more to him in this snow-cloughed spot to chastise him again, and she helps him fight his intensifying cultural and racial amnesia in foreign Canadian culturescapes. This war against amnesia can only be won through Pan-African and Pan-Caribbean reconnections. He reassesses his previous uniformed ideas about both his island and the African continent, and declares, this plateau I stand. From this part of land, I shall survey your contours and reclaim its landscape to help to
tonalize
your fears, challenge you to show yourself beyond the drunken tour guides, claiming sovereignty of his nation, that his nation is not a total rejection of his current Canadian liminal location, but to appropriate these Canadian spaces and cultivate and extend his African Arawak Carib identities to his daughter. Daughter of mine, together we must
build
our shrine in this far-off place. This idea of donning of Canadian ropes and feeding on African and Caribbean cuisine, kenke, pounded yams, in passion fruit and mango drips, as a measure of his cultural identity is ostensibly superficial. But food is instrumental to the processes of self-identification, place-making, and also nation and agency building. And the speaker is therefore not being superficial in engaging his African Caribbean foodscape to teach his daughter about her African Caribbean roots. Food in the migrant diasporic subject cosmos becomes tenaciously tethered to economics, the economies simultaneously and irreducibly national and moral, and also emotionally linked to the ecosphere of the Caribbean homeland. These emotional connections will incite the daughter to always, quote, remember that she is
a shade of
ebony. And though this ice keeps you wrapped in winter clothes, the shade of ebony links her to the stripes on the back of her grandfather. In the journey home, the speaker upfront laments the freezing and encasing of memories of his mother, etc. His mother, and yes?
His island.
His mother, his island. Silent gods of memory hang from a whispering tree and covered with icicles and wrestle my mother image from me. The unreflecting actions of African Caribbean immigrant writers in Canada exacerbate the situation. Seduced, entrapped, and addicted to materialism and consumerist exhibitionism, they abandon their calling to be Caribbean cultural retainers, arbiters, creators, and curators. In their amnesia, they produce only a reaction, anger, when their work should be, quote, time bombs to tear down those wailing walls, to break open borrowed monuments, whose necromancy bewitched the spider Anansi. They produce bombards for psychological diversions, devoid of inherent morality, mere mimicry.
Mediated
through panic, the panic beast of ancestors drum in tumult. Our one sacred songs are mute, our rhythms like the wiles of the shaman. Recognizing his own collusion in this, he confesses, if the tune of the flute doesn't resonate in this bamboo shoot, he laments, do not blame this foreign mother. It is I who've lost the conjure. The art of conjure. He then calls for a revival of lost connections of those our dismembered parts. He evocates names of ancestors of the resistance, Kujo, a Jamaican Maroon leader and a cousin of Nani of the Maroons, King Jaja of Opobo, who resisted the British takeover of the coastal trade in southeastern Nigeria, but was defeated by them and exiled to St. Vincent and Barbados, where he died. School children in Soweto, uprising against apartheid in the 1970s in South Africa. This roll call recenters his people's humanity in the cycle of humans. My humanity waits to walk across a vast expanse of flawless space. This humanity will rise clothed with heaviness of a fecund memory from the abysses of amnesia. God has retrieved African Caribbean humanity initiates a period of vibrant Pan-African Caribbean spiritual and cultural revivals. These poetic prophecies fulfill the visions of the future. These vestiges of memories, these inverted tales of mind no longer carry bandages of ignorance, but instead have transitioned from songs of sorrow into cantos of recovery. This paper was written as a kind of memorial for a friend who died in December from prostate cancer in Canada. So I took his books and read and decided to write this paper. It's been published already. An expanded version of it has been published in Canada last week in the journal.
Applause.
Thank you.
So we have some really, really interesting presentations at the end here of our day, because, you know, a lot of questions were brought up over the whole day about lenses and decolonizing lenses, and also about romanticization of things, that the romanticization that happens because of those lenses, the way they're polarized. So you talk about polarized lenses, like yes, okay, anyway, I won't keep up with that metaphor. But in any case, yeah, these binarities. So in other words, things that have been erased, things that have been marginalized, can also be romanticized. So there, and when you're in either one of those modes, you're still within the Western episteme. You're still within the colonial way of looking at things. Because if you go to one extreme or the other, it's fine. You're under control. What's not under control are these very nuanced, fuzzy understandings that don't fit into very well-defined boxes. And so I think that this is what the singers that Itza was talking about are trying to do. They're dealing with stuff that people would rather either not see or turn into something romanticized, but actually these are things that should be celebrated, but in a way that takes that looks at them as they really are, instead of some idealized notion of that. Also the films, all of the films that Elvin talked about did the same thing. So you saw films that explored, for example, a really hopeless situation. For example, with the character in Puerto, the character in Cuba, but at the same time, this figure is able to transcend all of that and to celebrate all of these other things. And you see all of those people celebrating, all of the protagonists being able to celebrate, but at the same time, in the midst of all of this other stuff that would maybe condemn others to a life where there would be no celebration and where a person would just be lost in despair. So all of them managed to come through it. And so what's painted in all of these films is a picture that's nuanced, that it's not just evil versus good, or true versus false, or real versus illusion. In other words, it's all woven together in really interesting ways. And then, of course, the final presentation by Professor Kuwabong was looking at the ways that people either buy into an erasure of Africa or go to the opposite pole of romanticizing Africa. And actually, both ways are under control of the symbolic elites and the ruling classes, because neither of them actually sees Africa for what it is. Okay, and it's only when you start to deal with what's right in front of you, what's in front of your eyes, instead of putting it into a box that has been provided to you by ruling classes, that you actually actually become a dangerous person, and a person who can really change things and actually begin the process of decolonizing our lenses. So these are great 3 presentations to end the day. So anyway, I would like to ask for questions or comments on any of the 3 presentations. Itza's on Puerto Rican women and music, Elvin's on film and queerness in the Caribbean, in Caribbean cinema, especially the economic context portrayed in those films. And then finally, Professor Kuwabong's powerful presentation about Horace Goddard's.
You mean questions? You are muted.
when I come back, I get muted. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I would like to apologize to Professor Kuwabong because again, he had one of those classic problems that we've all been facing with internet, and he had to go to his cell phone, and I can just see him there trying to catch the lines, the end of the line on his cell phone. So that's why I was trying to tell him the last word in the line, because I know he was. Yeah, I know he was struggling because I've been in that place before myself. I'm trying to read off of my cell phone, and then but I have to keep shifting the screen to get to the last word. So I could see what he was going through, and so I said, okay, let me just figure out if that word cannot be figured out from context, I will say it. I want to apologize to Professor.
No. You were discerning. You discerned properly.
Okay, but in any case, yes, let's have some questions and comments from the audience for these three excellent presentations.
Question for Elvin.
Okay, Elvin, you have a question. Be careful, this is going to be a tough one because it's coming from Professor
I think I watched either one of the movies that is Playing the Devil, and the producer or the director, writer-director from Bahamas, is it Bahamas, came here to Caribe Plurilingüe, Caribbean Without Borders, to present as a keynote speaker.
Govan.
Yeah, and my question is with this Playing the Devil, in what ways is it problematic to see the Indo-Trinidadian guy as the seducer of the black guy to come out of his closeted homosexuality, and then the black guy presented as the aggressive, violent, murderous type? That is there a kind of unconscious stereotypical representations of the Indo-Caribbean male as the feminine type, etc., etc. Though he is rich, he is of a higher class than the black guy, and so on. So I want you to respond to that. This is what some people may be looking at and flinching and saying, wait.
Yeah, I'm actually, I'm wondering, you call him Gregory, right? You call him the black guy, but I think they might identify more as Indo-Trinidadian. I'll need to reflect on that. In other words, I think all of them are identifying as Indo-Trinidadian rather than one is black and the other is.
Perhaps one is a Douglas and the other is Indo.
Yeah.
The mixing and the Douglas are more associated with the black African.
Yeah. I think that tension in Trinidad specifically, right, between Indians and Africans could be played out here, right, at a psychic level, and then manifested through this sexual relationship, where, as you say, more like psychoanalytically, right, that one is more passive and the other is more active, and it has this racial fantasy undertone. Yeah, I think we can view it that way.
And I think that all of your films actually didn't shy away from that. So in other words, you could see it in if you're dealing with economic asymmetries, then you're going, because of the intersectionality between racing, gendering, and classing as operations, colonial operations. So in other words, if you're going to deal with economic disparities, then you're automatically going to have to deal not only with class, but also with racing and also with gendering. So yeah, so it's the whole package. And one of the things you could say about these directors is that they're not shying away from that.
Yeah, like in Viva, you have the white tourist being the customer. In Dólares de Arena, you have a white woman and a Dominican, right, who's black. So and of course in Trinidad, you have it might not necessarily be European, but replicating these models. So certainly, but it's done subtly, right? It's not in your face. It's very subtle.
But I still echo Professor Kuwabong's unease, because what the intervention of Carnival and and especially the trope, once again, of gay or LGBTQI protagonists as dying at the end of the movie. In other words, death it's like that connection throughout the history of cinema. It's always like the gay characters always end in tragic death. I mean, they always meet a tragic end. So, and I mean, that's a reality. I mean, lots of LGBTQI people, plus people did and do still meet tragic death at the hands of people who do hate crimes and stuff like that. But to replicate it on the screen is something that always is shocking to LGBTQI plus people. So that's why that I kind of connected me back to what Professor Kuwabong was saying too, is that does that need to get repeated here? Did the film have to end that way? Couldn't there still be the same kind of outcome for Gregory without the other person dying, of course, which is always such a
And yet in Viva, Jesus lives. And the one who dies is the father, the homophobic father, right? Who has a change of heart.
And that's a change of the way this is depicted in cinema traditionally, because it would have been the son who would die eventually instead of the father. Yes, more comments. Anybody have anything for? Yes.
Other movies set in, I think, the Bahamas is much more complicated.
Children of God.
Children of God.
Yes. I prefer that movie, though I had a lot of issues with that also. But I was introduced to all of them by two students who were doing film for their master's, Caribbean women's cinema for their master's programs. So I watched movies from Cuba, from different places.
So but even that one also ended in death for a protagonist. Go ahead, Gabriel.
I just want to say thank you to all the presentadores y presentadoras today. It has been great. And I have some comments and questions. First with Dr. Kuwabong.
Yes.
It was a pleasure seeing and listening to your presentation, because you were somehow referring to poetry, yet your essays seem to be poetry to me. So there was the poem within the poem there, and it was really interesting and nicely done. I appreciate that. Somehow it made me think about your situation with your daughter. I'm sorry if I'm bringing that up in a personal level now, but that's another sense that I can make out of your presentation. It also reminded me of the discussions that we had with Africa Solo in your class, in your theater class. And there was an image at the beginning, I think it was the second slide, when you talk about the roots. And it made me think about our Creole class now, and how these rhizomas that need to be revised, because instead of keep cutting those roots, like maybe I have done that too as well, we need to start looking for those connections that are not only with the African continent, perhaps the Asian continent, even the Americas country. So that's just my comment with you. I will also like to ask Elvin a quick question. Elvin, gracias por la presentación. I don't know the movies, they really caught my attention, but I think that in the first presentation this morning it was brought up, and now Dr. Faraclas also brought it up with the Polaroid image. So I was wondering, or I am wondering, if those movies are actually, say for example, the Dominican movie is a Dominican production, meaning is it directed by Dominican people? The Cuban movie is it directed by Cuban people? Can you answer that, please?
Yes. So Dólares de Arena does have Dominican filmmakers, and the same, I think, with Play the Devil. With Viva, there's some funding from Europe. And I think that element of the funding, but the cast are of the region as well as the setting. So maybe Money, who's actually funding this, might have some foreign sources. But I think a lot of it, I mean, there's a Caribbean core to all these narratives.
Thank
So
you.
that's how I would answer.
Okay, anybody have a question or comment for Itza?
Well, it was interesting the fact that she brought up again Plena Combativa.
Yeah.
I don't know if she missed that presentation earlier with Alice. Hopefully she didn't, and if not, try to check out the reproduction of this whole symposium because it dialogues with your presentation.
So yes, one of the people in Plena Combativa was actually performing with Alice in her presentation today this morning. So it's really good that you brought them back into the sequence of presentations at the end, so we could go back to Plena Combativa and what they are doing. So again, and during that whole discussion, I think it was Professor Kuwabong who was saying that it could be that actually Plena originated as a female genre. Wasn't that you, Professor Kuwabong, was saying that?
Yes, I suggest that.
Yeah, so actually, even though it becomes a male-dominated genre, if you trace it back, you might find that that women's role in Plena might go back further than we normally suppose.
And I was going to suggest that there was an article I was writing something on a Canadian play, and I had to. No, it wasn't a Canadian play. It was sexism in Puerto Rican poetry in New York and so on. New Yorker poets, and I did research on music and sexism in salsa. And a Puerto Rican scholar, I've forgotten the title, but if I look at the paper that was published, I might find it begins like Asi song, and then it goes on, and how salsa, even though it's derogating women, disempowering them, calling them all the terrible things, they are just sex objects and whatnot, that women actually dance to them without recognizing. They may not like but they like the rhythm, etc., etc. And as you talk about reclaiming agency, empowering themselves through the same type of songs that may be talking about when a man loves women. That is Isabel La Negra and Isabel Lubersa, that famous song, and so on, set in Ponce, San Anton. That your presentation is actually showing there is a kind of calming of voice for women, and that these young artists who are creating their songs might be empowered, and also going against, not just using Plena, but even going against the reggaeton dehumanization of the female body. So you have this monster of a man, and all these beautiful girls trying to use him, and as if he's a god that is worshipped by women. So for me, it's not just Plena that your paper is important as it centers around all these other music forms that women can now reclaim their voices.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And that's actually I have to also look into that more as well. Thank you.
Yeah. What's up class at 4:30?
Let's see. Can people
more like we just open up more and more levels and dimensions, and it's such a beautiful space. Thank you to everyone. Muchos abrazos desde la montaña. Adiós, buen día.
Thank you, Yasmin. Olga has disappeared. Hello.
I turned off my camera and my microphone because I wanted to up the signal, up the power of the signal. So if people, so Itza, go ahead. If people hear Itza's voice going down, please turn off your video cameras. Okay.
Well,
Itza?
some of us have a 4:30 class.
Oh, okay. No, those of you who have your class, go ahead. But it's it's only 13 past 4. But in any case, if you need to go, you should go. But anyway, Itza, you were interrupted.
Yeah.
I think there was someone with a question.
Yeah, there is. But I think you wanted to say something, no? Angel has a question, but did you have something you wanted to say in response to what the others have said?
I think I got everything across. I don't know, maybe if
Okay,
I got...
good. Okay, Angel. Angel.
Can you
there
hear
you
me?
Are. Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you for the presentations. I really enjoyed them. They were amazing. But I wanted to comment on Itza's presentation. And I'm glad that one of you pointed out about the roots of Plena, because it's inferred that the roots come from women initially. And I wanted to comment on that because historically in Puerto Rico, that tradition was lost, and Plena was reserved for physically white men among Puerto Ricans. And it was first made in response to bomba in a more, let's say, classy or educated manner, or in a more classy and educated response to bomba. But then again, Black folk or people of color amongst Puerto Ricans who wanted to participate from Plena were often ostracized. And the idea of participating from bomba was often viewed as wrong. So as Itza was exposing and was giving us this information on Plena Combativa, which I didn't know either, did not know anything either. Yeah, I was very glad and I was very proud of this group, because it's a way of reclaiming ownership on music and tradition and on their roots. So this movement of empowerment and to some extent decolonizing music in Puerto Rico by Plena Combativa is actually it actually makes me feel very proud. And thank you for your presentation.
Itza, would you like to respond?
Thank you so much. Yes, I feel like they're definitely doing a great job. And I didn't know that fact about that deeper history of Plena. So that's definitely something that I am going to look into, because it sounds very interesting. So thank you.
Actually, if you go to there are like festivals, there are Plena festivals, and even sometimes they say that they're doing controversia. But at those festivals, you will see how the elements have been excluded and erased. So the people you will see singing are mainly people who have a European descended appearance. Okay, for example, the language has been very much domesticated. So there's been a whole process of legitimization, or sort of legitimization of that particular form and demonization of the related forms. And so controversia historically can be closely linked to like calypso. It can be like Professor Kuwabong said, it can be closely linked to just the dozens, like your mother stuff, okay? All of that Afro-Atlantic insult, ritualized insult tradition. So there's all of that going on too. And if you look at the official festivals, the language has been really, really sanitized. So this process that Angel is talking about is very much there in what is marketed today as controversia or Plena or that kind of thing. So, but actually, if you start going to the roots of it, then you'll see that it draws, it goes back to these very, very heavily African influenced traditions. And now with this other dimension, perhaps also very heavily female influenced traditions. Because I know that in West Africa, when I was studying controversia kind of things in phenomena in societies, women were just as much involved as men were. In other words, women were just as good at insulting other people with these ritualized insults as men were, and they would fight each other with verbal insults. And you can see in controversia, you do have women doing that, but again, they're usually European descended women, and it's also done using language that's very, very sanitized. And to the point where I can remember being at one of these festivals, and the person who was speaking at the microphone was trying to say that mapeye is actually comes from Spanish, okay? Rather than, I know that, okay, I mean, I don't believe in one cause for anything. Okay, but there's this word mapeye that's often used at these festivals. And mapeye has often been traced to some African roots or indigenous roots. But here was the sort of leader of that movement and that particular festival. He spent about 45 minutes saying, this doesn't come from Africa. This doesn't come from indigenous roots. This is European. So yeah, so there's all of that going on too. So there's been a lot of that kind of processes happening. And this gets us back to what Gabriel was saying of how these elements of Puerto Rican folklore have become bleached, have become gendered towards plus male, have been raised towards plus white, have been even in a lot of senses classed. Classed maybe not in terms of plus rich, but a plus rich understanding of what it is to be poor, like pobrecismo. So this sort of a romanticized version of what a jibaro is. So there's all of that going on at the same time. So your presentation actually brought us back to some of those points as well.
Definitely a lot to consider, yeah.
Yeah, but then the other thing is like the taboo stuff, okay? So in other words, menstruation. I mean, to make that something that people talk about and that people see as something that's not in, like there's all of this very, very, very demonizing stuff that's done around menstruation, and to make it something that people just see as that's what's in front of our eyes. Okay, it's part of reality, and it's an important part about the creation of life. None of us would be here without menstruation. I'm sorry. So in other words, it's something that we have to recognize, not romanticize or demonize. See it as what it is. See it for what it is, and acknowledge it and value it for the role that it plays in making us who we are. You know, so I think that's, I mean, that's one of the ultimate taboo topics. You know, I mean, think of how many times we actually talk about it, especially men will even mention that. It's like, oh no, if you mention it, you can't. It's like something that men are so afraid of. And it's good that one of the songs was all about, why are you afraid of me? You know, and it's part of that. Men are so afraid of women's creative powers. And
because according to motherhood theory, men are afraid because men are not co-creators with God. Whichever God is the woman. If you believe in the Christian religion, God did not use a man to impregnate Mary, if you believe in that story. If you follow Islam, it's the same story. They believe in the Jesus, miracle birth of Jesus. It's always the female. When Zeus was looking for children, he never used men, he used women. He raped virgins to produce Hercules and all those others. So there is that co-creativity that men are excluded from. And out of envy, out of fear that the woman could have strangled them in the womb, could have killed them, could have refused to birth them, and that it is through the woman's body after birth that they actually were connected and sustained with the breast milk and so on. So why shouldn't men fear women? So that's from other theories that co-create the female ability, biological ability to co-create with God. The psychic powers of the female, if she did not have psychic powers, how come suddenly she's carrying a fetus? So patriarchy had to invent that the man is the owner of the child, not the woman, and so on. Yet in everything, whether it's the earth, the atmosphere, the spirit world, is the female that is actually directing things and participating in things more than the man. So I just want to answer Professor Faraclas's that men, why are men afraid of women? Yeah, we are, because we can't do anything without them. Yeah.
Okay, I guess we are coming to an end now. We're already over time, and some people have a class in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So I think probably it's time to wrap up, but I really, really want us to give a big, big applause to all of the presenters, all of the people who asked great questions, all of the people who made great comments. So you can expect this event to happen again at the end of next semester. So somewhere around October or November. It happens every year, and you're all invited, whether you're a student at UPR, whether you're or not, whether you're a professor at UPR or not, you are all invited. Even people who may not have any position at any academic institution. If you're doing something really interesting with language, literature, or culture, of the Caribbean and the greater Caribbean, which includes all of the African diaspora, et cetera, then please consider presenting at the next Caribe Plurilingüe. Usually happens on a Friday towards the end of our semester, which means it'll happen probably towards the middle to end of October of 2021. And hopefully our next event will be presencial, face-to-face. But if not, this space is always there for us as well. So one more time, we'd like to thank all of you, and also to thank the Institute of Caribbean Studies for making this all possible. And until next time, stay safe. And I leave with my heart and my mind full of wonderful, wonderful gifts that you have all given me today in your presentations, in your comments, and in your questions. So take good care, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.